When the federal government enacted the Emergencies Act and it froze bank accounts, it demanded that banks across Canada froze bank accounts, and all the banks complied. What Danielle Smith said then was any banks that are Alberta-based credit unions, she would say, don't abide by that. And one thing to understand about provincial versus federal jurisdiction is property rights and are provincial, and then both provincial and federal government can have bank. They're regulated. That's the one under provincial laws, and then there's national laws.
Sure.
And so any banks that would have been under provincial law, she said that she would just be like, that's not enforceable here in Alberta. So there's ways of saying it and doing things on this particular issue. I don't know exactly the background. The health part is very interesting.
Mm-hmm. And I think that actually goes to your point earlier when you mentioned Roe v. Wade, because I feel
Yes.
like that was a demonstration in the U.S. of how, regardless of what your feelings on the actual abortion issue are, I think most legal people would legal people. There's a good way of saying most lawyers and judges and legal scholars would agree that that was just a ruling of that was just good legal interpretation, because it brought abortion legislation back fully into the purview of the states, if I understand it correctly.
Yes, and it's the same here in Canada. And then actually, I just remembered too, Lacrete, which is a small community in Alberta, they said we're not enforcing anything that COVID related.
Wow.
And so there you had, a municipality that didn't abide by any provincial mandates or federal mandates. They said no. And so there's always an ability to fight or to question or to be civil disobedient. You see that with Saskatchewan challenging the federal government on the energy stuff, and they said no, and then they were going to take them to court. Like, these things are good to challenge. I think that we need to start standing up and then seeing what happens. Like, what's the worst that's going to happen, really?
Well, exactly right. And I mean, I feel like there's a feeling among certain people, not of our particular political views, but maybe the prevailing view of most people who aren't fully, potentially, like, psychotically invested into this stuff like I am. But the general Canadian person's view of government is very trusting and very almost blasé about it. Very they're probably doing the right thing for the right reasons. But if you have that attitude, then you just, as we saw, you leave yourself open to potentially being taken advantage of by people who don't have everyone's best interest in mind.
There's also an aspect to that where I think when people see a government party or a part of the government who shares their views, they're more willing to imagine that government having more control.
Wow.
And then it's not until you realize, like, oh, well, what happens when somebody's in power who doesn't share your views? Then all that extra control is very, very scary to them. So it's the difference, it's the jurisdiction differences between federal, provincial, and municipal that gives a certain level of protection to individuals and communities, depending on, like, your needs are different here than, well, obviously in Quebec, they have, like, you want a town to run its own affairs because there's no possible way that a federal government would have the information and organizational ability to plan everything for every single little small town. So that's why we have a separation of power. And it's these checks and balances between these levels that it has to be a battle, because that's how we find out, that's how we navigate and we get closer to truth. We need this kind of constant opposition. And as soon as that opposition, this push-pull stops, we're in a bad place, because at no point will you ever naturally have 100% agreement. That will only happen if
Yeah.
it's manufactured. And top-down state control, there's no possible way for it to ever be able to like properly either plan an economy or handle social affairs or be able to navigate all these issues that are constantly in flux and need a whole bunch of people to be constantly solving these problems. So I feel like there's more power to the people if we reinforce each of these levels, if we contribute, if we participate, rather than just throwing our ball into the court into kind of into just the federal, just talking about federal issues or just dealing with it from the federal parties and saying like, oh, this is our last hope if we just get this one party elected. Like, well, what about the provincial? What about our cities? We have to start there.